All right, so it is Wednesday, May 9th. This is the Kubernetes Cloud Provider Working Group. We have a pretty packed agenda, so we'll get started. So I wanted to kind of go from like things that are going to be quick to discuss down to things that might take longer. So the first thing is the issue with AWS that we've been seeing, where we're not really reporting the secondary internal IP. Nick and Micah, do you guys want to give us a quick update on that?
Yeah, so I think the PR that we have out is ready to go. I've just been bugging Signode people, haven't heard anything back yet, so I'll continue that. But I think from our side of things, it sounds like, it looks good to you, so unless they have any objections, I think that's going to be ready to go for us. We decided not, I think just for now, to proceed with defaulting to the primary IPv4 in AWS, just because there's not enough information from the cloud provider to tell which one is the correct one in the event that you're not using our CNI provider. So we don't want to box in people to having to use our CNI provider or not being able to use a secondary IP. I think there could be a case made for for modifying the cloud provider's interface to have a selected IP. After looking at like the Google and the Azure providers, they're slicing off the first private IP. So that could, later be fixed, but I think for now we're satisfied with this fix, and we can bring that up at a later time.
I see. So leave things the way they are for everyone else, and for any kind of setup that uses the AWS CNI plugin would have to set the node IP?
That's correct.
Okay. That seems reasonable. Okay, cool. So yeah, let us know if you're blocked on anything. It seems like some people are getting kind of slow to review it, so I don't know. Let us know. Maybe we can poke them or something.
Okay. Yeah. If you have any influence or sway or know people,
maybe Jago. But yeah, we'll deal with it later. Okay. So then there's the cat PR that.
Sorry, I was muted. You can reach out to me if there's something I can help out with on that. I did capture the notes, but it sounds like you just default to the conventional behavior and then may require setting an additional value if using the AWS CNI provider. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
We're just having a hard time getting the right people to review the PR. So if you have influence or if you can poke someone to get it kind of prioritized, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Hit me up on Slack and remind me later today, and I'll go kick some shins. Happy to
Will
do
do.
that.
Thank you so much.
Great. All right. So the cat PR that Chris opened, which is really just kind of copying what we had previously into the actual cat document, which kind of adds requirements for the new repos that we're going to be setting up. Chris, do you want to give us a quick update on that? I think it's pretty much good to go.
Yeah, there was that was more or less. This came out of the response for when we were in part when we were creating these new provider repositories within the Kubernetes org to establish some minimum set of standards for. The KEP captures a lot of the technical details of what we're trying to accomplish with the cloud manager code, but also just setting some conventions for if you want to have a Kubernetes org repository, what the basic requirements for that are. There are some notes there that this is very much a work in progress, and I actually think that this kind of flows into the this is actually larger with the scope of the meeting for the docs, but also for the SIG proposal that is scheduled for the end of the meeting. But essentially, this should be considered a work in progress in some ways, and we as a working group, all of the cloud providers should take a good look at that and see if kind of the requirements that we set forth there are something that they feel good with, and and if there are changes, we should make those changes because it's meant to create consistency, but it's also meant to make sure that everybody can be successful at building their provider code out. So that's where that is. You should feel free to go take a look at that PR. I think there's a link in the in the Google Doc for that. Similarly, the next item on the agenda is the docs update, and so I've been working with the docs team about how to handle upstream, how to handle provider documentation within the Kubernetes docs, and the kind of the original motivation was to actually just remove those documents entirely, so that there was no mention of it. They weren't there. In part because it was hard. It's hard for the Kubernetes org to maintain the correctness and consistency of those documents. They're not experts. They're not, they don't know if those documents are good or bad, if they're being maintained or looked at. And so, this feeds back into the previous item, is that we, as a group, we need to establish a basic level of standards. And my proposal is that there's a getting started guide. So just how do you plug this in and how do you use it within your cloud? And also a guide that documents a configuration guide. So all the parameters that are available, how you configure and what they mean. And that the working group would vet those set of documents, and then kind of once we formalize that, the docs team will look at a way to automate the generation of the Kubernetes org documentation, so that if it's in one of the repositories and we've flagged it in some way as something that we want to publish, and that we promise to maintain, and so so that we'll make sure that the individual providers are staying on top of that, staying on top of those documents. They'll be ready to come up with a way to publish those. And it's going to dovetail in nicely with their with how they're changing their documentation generation and hosting. But for that workload, that's on us now to come up with those standards and enforce them amongst everybody, and then get back to docs and say that we're ready to publish.
Okay.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, seems pretty straightforward to me. Cool. Do you know if Dims is in this chat, in this video call? Give an update on the end-to-end tests.
Dims is very overworked, so I imagine that he has probably, it may have slipped his calendar. I can give a little bit of context for that too, more of a higher level. I haven't been as involved technically as much as Dims has, but OpenStack is for our provider. We're triggering a whole suite of tests for that are reporting. They're not reporting back to test grid. We're working on getting those to report back to test grid. And our approach to testing the provider itself was to, the first thing we did is Dims set up a test job for testing Minikube. And that served as the foundation for, got that into test grid and was having that reporting. And that's where we started from. And basically it meant that we took that test, we changed some of the configuration to load the provider code and enable it and run the end-to-end testing. Those logs have to be sent to some S3 compatible container so that test grid can read from it. That's kind of the high level, position of how we enable the end-to-end testing for the OpenStack cloud provider. And you should be able to see it in our. I'll drop some links into the document about exactly where we define those test jobs. Yep. We're using something called OpenLab, which kind of federates a bunch of different clouds and allows us to set up jobs that use Zool CI to report back to they're triggered from that, and then they report back to GitHub. And I think that there's a Prow plugin, or if there's not, we're working on one.
Okay. Yeah, I know Dims has been posting PRs in the channel on how we did certain things like set up the test job. So yeah, I'd want to work with him to have a document that we can point to just to kind of help people get started. It doesn't have to be a document that works for every cloud, but just a document that kind of provides kind of the big picture on how to get started.
Yeah, I think over the next few weeks, it's going to be difficult for us to generate that document, just because we have the OpenStack Summit starting 2 weeks from, yeah, well, basically that's basically in 2 weeks, and so it's probably going to be about 3 weeks before we can really devote attention to that, because I know that everyone is, I know that I am, and Dims and Melvin are all working pretty hard to prepare presentations and keynotes for that.
Okay, cool.
There was that original document from Ben the Elder that was about how to post conformance test results back to test grid. It would be great to just expand on the doc that exists and correct what was not right. That's a little bit of a lower bar of effort than starting a new doc and figuring out what the format is and all that as well. Even if they're just PRs or notes that are rough that you can send to him, we can ask him to just update that doc and make sure it's accurate and as useful as possible.
Yeah, that would be excellent. I'll dig into it.
Great.
Do you have a link to that Ben the Elder doc handy? I'm sure I can dig it up somewhere too.
I'll find it and drop it in. I think I have it in some tab somewhere.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Okay, Chris, you're up again for deprecating entry providers.
Yeah, so we have sent up code, and it was just merged. That adds a code path to officially deprecate the entry providers. Essentially, when you're ready to deprecate your provider, you add its name to the list of providers that have been deprecated, and if the user attempts to load that code, a warning will be emitted saying that, warning the user about the deprecation and encouraging them to use the external provider. So there's a link to that. It's pretty simple, and I just wanted to make everybody aware of it. So as they work through their projects, that's the location where you can enable that trigger.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if we want to be pushing for pushing all the entry providers to be doing this at this very moment, but I think it's good to know that we should at least start that maybe when we're a little bit into beta release in 1.11. But I mean, sorry.
I have a question on that. Is there an expectation when potentially we're going to have all the entry providers deprecated in terms of release number?
We don't have a concrete release number yet. So the plan is to do that, but given how many people are running Kubernetes and depend on that entry provider, we have to be really careful about how we deprecate it and give plenty of time for people to adapt.
I was thinking more like a target release where potentially we're going to have all the providers with a deprecation notice, not necessarily with the code not being there. Right. I mean, a point where we have, okay, everybody should run out of 3 providers. All of them will still be there, still all deprecated, but kind of a cutting point.
I mean, yeah, my feeling from leadership throughout the community is that sooner rather than later is preferred, but I haven't heard any hard and fast dates. I think that maybe that is what would be one of the action items determined by the new SIG leadership.
Makes total sense. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think the approach we've taken so far is to try and make use the carrot as much as possible, make it compelling and more useful and safer and faster iteration for existing cloud providers to move out of tree and not have to wait for the entire Kubernetes project to move along and so on and so forth. But I think we have critical mass and enough effort going into it to move along and show the benefit. We also have to show the safety and that it works and that it's not overly complicated. And so that will drastically reduce the amount of clamoring if any deprecation policy is announced at some point. So I think that's the prerequisite. And then we'll revisit that if there's any stick to go along with the carrot. I don't know yet. I think that's a question for steering committees and SIG architecture and others.
I can speak from the SIG OpenStack side that our out of tree provider has progressed beyond what the in-tree provider does. We've had faster velocity on it. It's it's better now. You know, we encourage people to use the out of tree provider rather than the in tree because we're just doing bug fixes on in tree now.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And on a related note, I think Nick brought up a couple weeks ago a concern about like how what it's going to look like to actually maintain code in tree and out of tree. And we did talk about maybe creating a staging directory in tree Kubernetes that we can kind of sync to out of tree. So that's still kind of up in the air. We don't have a great story about how we're going to do that, but definitely in the upcoming weeks we'll kind of talk about that more.
Actually, on that note, I have a proposal that I've just finished writing up that I've been promising for a couple of weeks, and it's ready. It actually discusses this in detail, so I will add it very shortly to this meeting and also to the appropriate what's the word I'm looking for? Where everyone discusses.
RFC.
So thank you. Brain just froze. I will add a link to it to the Slack channel as well. So if people could take a look at that, it'd be greatly appreciated.
Cool. That'd be great. Okay. So yeah, last on the list is talking about SIG provider. So at KubeCon, had a chance to kind of talk to different clouds. And I think, you know, we didn't actually get a chance to do like a meeting where everyone was there, but I think all of us individually had a chance to talk with each other and get a general idea of where we want to head with this initiative. So it seems like so far every cloud that I've talked to, or at least technical leads of the clouds that I've talked to, have been pretty okay with the idea of as a long-term goal to have each SIG for today's clouds to be kind of folded into a working group that would be under one cloud, which we're hoping to call a SIG provider. So I've kind of written up a proposal that talks about why we want to do this and what the long-term goals would be. And I also added a charter in the documentation that we're going to add to the community repo to show kind of what exactly falls under the responsibility of this new SIG. So I do want to send this out to the steering committee within the next week to kind of move things forward. So would really appreciate it if everyone can give it a read and we can talk maybe next week about any feedback that might be blocking the proposal from going out.
Yeah, and I think the terminology du jour is that the existing cloud SIGs would be sub-projects of a containing SIG. Not working groups, and the distinction is that working groups should be ephemeral and cross SIG cutting, where subprojects are part of a SIG that has a long-term objective and owns code. So in Walter's document, you'll see some discussion about what code is owned, and I think just to reiterate, I don't think we can repeat enough times, the more common code we can share rather than copy, paste, global search and replace and deviate from each other, the better we will all be. So we should strive for that wherever possible. So I agree the general consensus is
what happens to all the subprojects that are currently under this, for example, SIG AWS or SIG GCP?
Yeah, oh goodness, there you always have to ask the hard questions. I don't know if subprojects are hierarchical, and I think there will be lots of opinions on whether those continue to be their own SIGs or not. I think what we don't want is there are, I think, 61 certified Kubernetes providers and distros. I don't think we want 61 SIGs for those things. And so then it becomes really hard to figure out what is the criteria to be a SIG or not a SIG. And some folks want the SIG lead role attached to their GitHub handle or something. We want to avoid all of that if we can. And if we can just have one, base it on what is useful for a group of people to get together and talk about, and how do we manage the code ownership aspect of it. I'm hopeful we can come up with a reasonable approach.
Yeah, so the proposal just talk about how it says like working group or something similar. So yeah, like sub-project or whatever we can, I think, do you know if there's any like anything officially a sub-project like a cloud would be? Like is there something right now in the Kubernetes project that is a sub-project of a SIG that we can reference to as an example?
Yes, so the steering committee or SIG architecture, someone asked all of the SIGs to come up with charters and collect the articulate what their sub projects are. So in the repo now, I know API Machinery, for example, went through and sorted out what are the sub projects there. One of them is like the sample API server. Another one is maybe
So like
client.
EDM would be like a sub project of SIG cluster lifecycle.
Yeah, or yes, exactly.
Okay.
And so the intention is that it is entirely owned by that SIG, but there might be a subset of the people in that SIG that meet and discuss and it, and not everyone.
Okay.
I think there's enough online to look at now, so you'll get a sense of the trending direction. And I know Jace and Caleb have been putting a lot of time into figuring out what this structure should look like.
Yeah.
But I think today there are like 30 SIGs, and the calendar is ridiculous at this point, especially morning time, so that it's European friendly times are no longer available.
Yeah.
So I don't want to go to 5 a.m. meetings as the only option that's left.
One thing to consider is the impact on face-to-face meetings. At the conferences, like I know that for our intro we have previous KubeCons we've had as many as 60 people show up at some of our sessions. And I know that there's a fear in our community that we're going to like lose that opportunity to work with our contributors and our users, as we lose the SIG label. So it's something that I don't know how the other cloud providers, what their attendance of these things has been like, but I know that is one of the concerns that has been expressed to me.
Yeah, that's a good one to bring up. Again, I think it's a balance. I think it's a balance between, somewhere there's either a hard limit of what fits in a human mind or a number of meetings that the same people can go to or something.
Yeah, and to be clear, I think this is the right move. I mean, I think it's I think out of code management and fairness, personally I think it's the right move. So
cool. So
okay, thanks.
So Jago, do you know, so aside from, kind of hashing out those details in the proposal and kind of having a charter that we all agree with, do you know what other steps we can do to kind of move this forward aside from just emailing the steering committee about it?
I think that is the next step. I don't know if there was an email that went out to the existing SIGs. Maybe Chris, did you get an email about coming up with a charter and some set of documentation about the intention?
I know that I wrote a charter at one point that was in a Google Doc, but I don't think it followed the standards.
Okay, I will follow up and send out whatever that email was to the working group email list, because whatever we put together, that will be the first response. So we might as well get that one out of the way and make sure that whatever documentation we submit complies with the new request.
Yeah, I'll drop a link to the original charter that I wrote up last year too.
Actually, I do remember clearly from last week at KubeCon, somebody from the steering committee mentioned that the process to create a new SIG is to actually start a PR first and then start discussing, because apparently they're receiving tons of emails on the mailing list, and they don't like to do this sort of shuffling through the emails just to figure out what's the history or what's the discussion for the SIG creation. So I think I don't know, that was one data point that I remember clearly from last week.
Yeah, that is a good point. I know Jace has been directly involved in this, so I'll just email him and the list, and so then I take myself out of the critical path as I get busy later in the morning. So
Yeah, that'd be great, just to have some concrete steps on how to push this forward.
great.
Thanks. All right, I think that's it for today. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, folks.